Episode 77, The High Price of Polygamy and Power in Early Utah. Welcome to the Hidden and Distorted History of the Church series, where we will be looking at the historical aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. In this series, I will try and inform those unaware of the true facts of Mormon history. Recap. Last week, Brigham Young staked out the Salt Lake Valley for the Salt Lake Temple, while Utah became the only Western territory to legally protect both African and Native American slavery. The California gold rush erupted, fueling mass migration, while the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo returned Utah to U.S. jurisdiction, undermining Mormon aspirations for a self-governed enclave. Oliver Cowdery quietly rejoined the church, and settlers faced massive cricket infestations, known as the Miracle of the Gulls. Brigham Young declared the state of deseret, which Congress ignored. Meanwhile, the 49ers surged west, with opportunists like Samuel Brannan profiting massively from the gold rush, while Salt Lake served as a key transit hub. This week, we watched James Strang flip on polygamy, while Brigham Young launches the Perpetual Emigration Fund, a loan system for European converts. Meanwhile, John Taylor publicly denies polygamy on his mission in France, unaware that he already has multiple wives in the U.S. The Pearl of Great Price is released, but not in America, in England. Young calls a crucial vote on Utah law and church practice, publicly acknowledges polygamy, and legalizes slavery in the territory. You won't want to miss this explosive episode. Part 1. Polygamy's grip. Strang joins the pattern. James Strang, a former follower of Joseph Smith, Jr., who claimed prophetic succession after Smith's death, began as a staunch opponent of polygamy. He denounced it as a corruption that threatened the church's integrity and insisted his stance reflected Smith's original teachings, portraying the founder as publicly condemning the practice, even as it quietly took root in Nauvoo. Strang cast himself as a moral guardian, warning that plural marriage was socially corrosive and spiritually dangerous. Yet in 1849, Strang himself married Elvira Eliza Field. Over the next several years, he added Mary Abigail Peirce, 1851, Elizabeth McNutt, 1852, Sarah Adelia Wright, 1855, and Phoebe Wright, 1855, as wives. He justified the practice by claiming it elevated and liberated women, allowing them to choose men they deemed most suitable and to secure prosperous lives, even if the man already had other wives. By embracing plural marriage, Strang not only reversed his earlier public opposition, but shattered the very moral platform on which he built his authority. His sudden about-face exposes his claims of insight into Joseph Smith's secret doctrines as opportunistic at best and outright deceptive at worst. In the end, Strang's shift to polygamy revealed not prophetic conviction, but the same pattern of self-serving reinvention that plagued Mormon leadership after Smith's death. That same year, Brigham Young launched the Perpetual Emigration Fund, officially framed as a way to help impoverished European converts make the journey to Utah. On the surface, it sounded charitable, but the reality was far more calculated. Converts were already paying tithes and contributing to church storehouses, yet the fund forced them to take high-interest loans just to secure passage. These loans were rarely optional, and failure to repay could limit a member's ability to migrate, effectively tying physical mobility to obedience. The fund enriched church leadership, consolidating Young's wealth and extending his authority over both the finances and the lives of followers. Beyond mere economics, it was a mechanism of control. Who could settle in Salt Lake, who could prosper, and who remained dependent on church approval all flowed through the PEF. Over time, it became more than a migration tool. It was the backbone of Young's system of control, deciding who could settle, who could prosper, and who remained dependent. The Perpetual Emigration Fund ensured that loyalty in Utah was owed not just to faith, but to Brigham Young himself. Part 2. Theocracy in Utah, Deception in France. In 1850, following the passage of the Utah Organic Act as part of the Compromise of 1850, Brigham Young was appointed by President Millard Fillmore as the first governor of the newly created Utah Territory. This territory, encompassing most of present-day Utah and portions of Nevada, Colorado, and Wyoming, was largely settled by members of the LDS Church, whom Young led as church president. His appointment was unprecedented, placing him in a position of dual authority, both civil and religious, effectively giving him near total control over the territory. While this allowed for efficient organization of settlements and governance in a remote, sparsely populated region, it blurred the line between church and state and raised alarms in Washington about the potential for a theocracy. As governor, Young established administrative structures, coordinated resources, and sought peace with some Native American tribes, often appointing church leaders to civil offices. At the same time, his leadership allowed the secretive practice of polygamy to continue largely unchecked, creating long-term tensions with federal law. Young's dual role as prophet and governor set the stage for rapid development in Utah, and for open conflict with the U.S. government, culminating in the Utah War of 1857. Meanwhile, in July 1850, Apostle John Taylor was serving as a missionary in France, where he engaged in a public debate in Boulogne-sur-Mer. During the exchange, he emphatically denied that the church practiced polygamy, insisting it was neither doctrine nor law within Mormonism. Yet Taylor had already married 12 women and fathered 8 children, making his denial a calculated deception aimed at preserving the church's image as conventionally Christian. Years later, in 1866, Taylor, then 58 years old, married 16-year-old Josephine Elizabeth Ruesch. By that time, the church had openly acknowledged polygamy. Yet Taylor's actions underscored his continued participation in a practice he had once denied so forcefully. The proceedings of the Boulogne debate were later compiled and published by Taylor in a pamphlet titled 3 Nights Public Discussion. This disingenuous debate was then circulated by the church to promote missionary efforts in England. Part 3. Doctrines, Discretion, and Double Standards. In June 1851, the LDS Church published the first edition of the Pearl of Great Price in Liverpool, England. Overseen by Church President Brigham Young, the compilation brought together several texts produced by Joseph Smith over the preceding decades, including the Book of Abraham, the Book of Moses, selections from Smith's translation of the Bible, some of his revelations, and other documents. The Book of Abraham portion, which Smith claimed to have translated from Egyptian papyri he purchased in 1835, presented a narrative of Abraham's life and teachings not found in the Bible. It recounted Abraham's journey from Ur, his visions, and his theological insights into God, creation, and the cosmos. Publishing these texts in the Pearl of Great Price represented a deliberate effort by church leaders to consolidate Smith's non-biblical writings into a single volume for doctrinal and missionary purposes. The compilation was intended for both LDS members and potential converts in England, serving as a tool to explain the church's unique doctrines and scriptural claims. The inclusion of the Book of Abraham was particularly significant because it introduced distinct LDS teachings about pre-mortal existence, the nature of God, and the organization of the cosmos, concepts absent from traditional Christian scripture. I cover the controversies surrounding the Book of Abraham in Episode J, the Book of Abraham. The publication of the Pearl of Great Price had been delayed for several practical reasons. While Joseph Smith had published snippets of the Book of Abraham in the Times and Seasons newspaper in Nauvoo during the late 1830s and early 1840s, compiling all of his revelations, translations, and other writings into a cohesive volume required significant editorial work. Smith's death in 1844 left much of this material unfinished, and the church's migration to and settlement in the Salt Lake Valley limited the resources available for printing and organizing texts. Additionally, arranging for printing in Liverpool, England, where the church had an established missionary presence, presented financial and logistical challenges. These factors combined to delay the first formal publication until 1851. On September 9, 1851, Brigham Young called a vote among church leaders on 2 issues that revealed a striking double standard. First was the word of wisdom, which remained merely a suggestion rather than a commandment, yet was enforced selectively among members. Second was the use of excommunication for failing to pay tithing, a measure church leaders approved that tied spiritual discipline directly to financial compliance. Meanwhile, Young and other top leaders owned distilleries and openly sold alcohol, flagrantly violating the very health code they demanded of the rank and file. Members were expected to abstain under threat of spiritual penalty, yet those at the top profited from the vice. The vote highlighted not only the tightening of control over members' behavior, but also the stark hypocrisy of church leaders who demanded obedience while enriching themselves through the very vices they condemned. Part 4. Opening the doors on polygamy. In 1852, Brigham Young publicly acknowledged for the first time that the church sanctioned polygamy, ending years of secrecy and denials. Up until that point, plural marriage had been practiced quietly among church leaders and select members, while outward denials masked the reality. For years, leadership had enforced strict obedience and moral standards on ordinary members, even as they secretly engaged in behavior that outsiders and converts would have considered scandalous or outright illegal. By going public, Young signaled that polygamy was no longer a private experiment, but an official, sanctioned part of church life, despite its clear violation of U.S. social norms and laws. The announcement entrenched plural marriage as a defining institution of the Latter-day Saints and set the stage for decades of tension, legal conflict, and moral controversy. Members were expected to accept a practice that had been hidden from public view, while the leadership had already normalized it for themselves. This moment crystallized a pattern of secrecy, selective enforcement, and leadership privilege, revealing a stark divide between the rules imposed on ordinary members and the liberties exercised by those at the top. Part 5. Institutionalized racism in Utah. In early February 1852, Brigham Young, wielding both ecclesiastical and territorial authority as president of the LDS Church and governor of Utah, took decisive steps to codify racial hierarchy within the territory and the church. On February 3rd, he issued an official act establishing Utah as a slave territory, formally legalizing the ownership of enslaved people. This action aligned with his earlier statements and policies accepting slavery, particularly the ownership of black and indigenous people brought into the territory by Mormon settlers. By granting legal sanction to slavery, Young brought Utah's governance in line with pro-slavery norms prevalent in parts of the United States, even as the LDS Church portrayed itself as a morally upright community. The following day, February 4th, Young issued a public church proclamation declaring that black men could not hold the priesthood, officially barring them from ecclesiastical authority. In this statement, he linked religious privilege directly to racial exclusion, codifying a policy that would remain in force for more than a century. The proclamation reinforced the racial hierarchy already embedded in Utah's newly established slave laws, signaling that both political and spiritual power were reserved almost exclusively for white church members. Taken together, these actions demonstrate how Young used his dual roles to institutionalize racial discrimination, shaping both the governance of the territory and the internal structure of the church along explicitly radicalized lines. Through these measures, he intertwined church and state authority to enforce white privilege, marginalizing black individuals politically, socially, and spiritually for generations. I hope you learned something new. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and follow for more no-fluff, ex-Mormon content that cuts through the faith-promoting fog. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.